Good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Flight Medic Barry. You're joining me for another episode of Beyond the Sirens podcast. I'm so glad to have each and every one of you along with us. We have a special guest with us today who's going to talk to us about EMS education, and we're going to go into the history of EMS education. We're really going to go into the weeds on emergency medical services education. As you all may know or may not know, this is EMS week, and we're really excited to be able to bring out our special sets of podcasts in dedication for EMS week, and really just being able to provide you some really cool content about emergency medical services. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, you know the drill. We got to go 10-8 in service, wheels up, visors down, and we are off, ladies and gentlemen. So without further ado, we're going to bring in our guest, and today our guest is Leväi, who is just an educator and just about everything. Might as well be an astronaut as far as I'm concerned. He's got everything, and he's an awesome resource. So we'll just invite him in and get a chance to really pick his brain and see what we can obviously extrapolate from that mind of his. So Jay, welcome to the podcast. We're so glad to have you, and so glad to have you a part of the family of Beyond the Sirens, and welcome.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I'll enjoy it here. It's pretty nice.
So can you kind of just, for the viewers who don't know you or may not know who you are, kind of like where your background, like where you came from, and kind of like how you tie into EMS education?
Sure. So I just completed my doctorate of functional medicine. I am kind of all over the place. I'm a prior service Army Nurse Corps NCO, and then I advanced a little bit in EMS before I decided that I wanted to kind of settle in nursing. Nursing was not necessarily the best job for me. So I went from EMT to advanced EMT. I'm still at the EMT level, but I have the capacity to function as a paramedic for the state due to some waivers. I am a certified EMS instructor in the state of Texas. I've been teaching since 2016, which comes with a number of different modalities, including all of your fancy card courses, your EMT basic course. I do teach the advanced EMT course and certain aspects of the paramedic course, but I also teach some more specialized skill sets, like how to intervene in crisis. So I teach the crisis care course, the crisis care initiative course, certain aspects about mental health resilience, how to interact with psychiatric patients, and then some other small niches like geriatrics and hazmat and a number of different things. So there are a number of different things that I teach for EMS specifically, but I also teach at the collegiate level for allied health education. My actual first undergrad is in allied health education, so I do have the capacity to teach a lot of the prerequisites for professional programs. So pre-nursing, pre-PA, pre-med, pre-dentistry, pre-vet, and then your degrees in paramedicine. So I kind of have a very broad spectrum of educational realms.
Yeah. So like I said, everybody, if you can teach it, he teaches it. I tell you, and we're not surprised at all when he pulls out another cert saying I can teach this, and it's just blows our minds every time. But crazy enough, if anybody didn't know, Jay actually kind of informed me that EMS week actually comes with different themes for each day. So from Sunday to Friday, each day is dedicated to a specific theme, kind of for us to address within the EMS community. And so you mind kind of touching on that a little bit, Jay, since you kind of had to inform me, and I've been in EMS for 11 plus years, and I had no idea.
Sure, absolutely. So a lot of the aspects of EMS Week having specific days are established by a number of different organizations. So it's something that's happened within like the last 10 years or so. I've been working in EMS for the last 10 years or so, but it hasn't really been hit hard until like 2016, 2017. So we're not really that far behind the curve. But to kick off EMS week on Sunday, we talk about health, wellness, and resilience as far as the individual EMS provider going out and performing their job, but also making sure that they have the capacity to take care of themselves so that they have the skills that are required to take care of other people. We hit Monday, which is EMS Education Day, which talks about the history of education, and then talking about the trajectory or how we see education moving in the next 5 to 10 years based on individual organizations. So the NREMT has their specific stuff, the NAEMT has their stuff, and so does COAMPS and CAPC. So they all cover a bunch of different things. Tuesday is Safety Tuesday, where we start to talk about safety on the job. and also safety for your patients. So certain things as simple as whenever you get into an accident, making sure that the nose of your vehicle is pointing at the right direction, and you're using a safety jacket, and that you're conducting traffic appropriately so that you don't become a casualty yourself. All of those types of things are covered on Tuesday. On Wednesday, it's EMS for Children Day, and a lot of people get confused about that, but it more so kind of tackles what it is that we're supposed to do for the community in regards to pediatric patients, such as how to appropriately put in car seats, certain things as far as teaching the public or the local area things like CPR. And stop the bleed, and some of those basic courses to make sure that their children are safe. So if there is an emergency situation that happens, they know how to kind of intervene with certain things while they're waiting for 911 to get there, so they can actually appropriately pass off appropriate patient care. Thursday is going to be Save a Life Day. So this is general CPR and stop the bleed stuff. Just in general, the idea is on Thursday, whenever we do that, we go out into the public and we actually teach our public these courses. A lot of people don't recognize this, but EMS technically has been charged with the duty of community-based education whenever it comes to these life-saving skills. And I think that oftentimes we tend to forget that that is a huge portion of what it is that we do. While we do participate in a lot of patient care-based activities, there are a lot of things that we're supposed to be doing with our communities that we've kind of fell behind upon. The pandemic didn't necessarily help, but there have been many a time where I have gone through and I've gone to the public health department and taught new moms, new parents, new birthers how to put in a seating arrangement for their children in their vehicles, which is what that Thursday is for. And then Friday is just general EMS recognition day. We start to talk about the different levels of EMS practitioners that work in the EMS field, and start to highlight certain things that EMTs and EMS professionals do that are pretty non-standard or different than our patient-centered medical home model counterparts. So your nurses and your ER staff and your inpatient staff. So with that, we kind of structure out until Friday, and then usually other things are left to the jurisdiction of the local stuff. So Saturday and Sunday are typically done specifically with the local area.
Yeah, it was a mind blowing to me to know that I've been doing EMS for this long and didn't realize that there is specific things that we should be focusing on each day and kind of paying homage to. And I think that's really enlightening for us. And if you're watching too as well, that we kind of start, if you didn't know, we can now kind of carry on that torch from here on out. So I think now, as since we're kind of covering day 2, even though we're in day 3, but we're covering education. I think it's only appropriate to kind of talk about how we got here. How did EMS education get from kind of the old ways of the past to the current present? And being that you are the educational guru, I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge on that. So could you kind of let the viewers know how we got to where we are now in EMS education?
Sure. So our current modern day EMS actually stems from the Civil War. A lot of people don't recognize that, but the first time that a true field ambulance was utilized was in the Civil War. Some of the basic modalities of emergency medicine that we still carry on today, like the use of the tourniquet and the rapid field assessment, kind of on active duty, we call it care under fire, and tactical field care. And whenever we start to approach those things, we start to recognize that there are a lot of things that the United States military has actually taught to those of us on the civilian side with the conversion, so that one, it's not reinventing the wheel, but two, we noticed that there was a dire need for those things in the civilian aspect. Whenever we started using things like an ambulance that could carry more than one person, or we started using things like improvised tourniquets that were not just cravats and sticks, we noticed that there was an increase in survivability and a decrease in mortality, essentially being established that early on. So this is like almost 150 years ago. So at that point, it's kind of there's a huge difference between how we practice now and how we practice then, but a lot of the basic aspects of how we practice now did root in that specific time frame. A lot of things were managed originally by the Department of Transportation and the National Health and Safety and Traffic Association, and they pretty much held a lot of the responsibility that we had as far as kind of identifying what a true scope of practice was before the national EMS standards were established, and then how things kind of progress as far as education goes, because education for EMTs when it first started was was very minimal. It is not near what it is that we test on at the current point or at the current time. Segueing into the 70s or so was whenever the National Registry actually started credentialing EMTs. The 1970s was probably one of the most pivotal aspects or time frames for EMS because it did provide an established minimum standard for all EMS providers that function in the United States, so that people were not getting subpar education in one state and being extremely educated in another state, and that previous state, that first state, being completely deficient whenever it came to patient care. Kind of recognizing that that was an issue was something that they recognized very early on, but they didn't have the capacity to figure out how to do that until the National Registry was established, and their sole job was to make that specific capacity for credentialing, which I think is pretty cool. In 1978, the first ever paramedic exam that came from the National Registry was administered in Minnesota. And then at that point is whenever we actually gained a lot of traction as healthcare providers because we became a part of the National Commission of Health Certifying Agencies. And that specific agency is responsible for maintaining pretty general oversight for all of the programs that provide some type of certification or licensure within the United States. It's one of those boards that is like the grandfather, of course, whenever mom and dad are sitting within their respective organizations, but they provide general oversight and the capacity to mediate for a lot of different issues that go there. If we kind of jump forward into the late 90s, we start talking about the Department of Transportation taking over hold of the national EMS standards. And then we start talking about how mid-level EMTs or the advanced EMT or what was previously the intermediate EMT kind of switched a bit. There were like 2 or 3 different educational programs for intermediate EMTs at a very early level. And that's because it was very hard to figure out what the scope of practice for an advanced or an intermediate EMT would be at that point. So you've got your EMT or EMT I-99, there was an 81, and then there was the first one that was ever established. But that paved the way for determining what the scope of practice for ALS providers was going to look like in the future. A lot of people now in practice don't currently consider advanced EMTs individuals who should be running ALS on their own, but in certain states they have the capacity to do that. Like in Texas, for example, advanced EMTs have the capacity to work at a paramedic level as long as the medical director has cleared them out on doing that, because an ALS assessment is an ALS assessment. It's essentially just teaching you additional drugs to manage specific conditions, most likely cardiac. That's the biggest difference between an advanced EMT and a paramedic, but that did happen. If we jump into the 2000s, it was very hard at the beginning of the 2000s for EMTs to maintain how they were, because this was the first experience that we had experienced as a population where the cost of taking the test was not feasible for individuals to pay out of pocket. There were a lot of restrictions that were placed on states that required the NREMT to provide a lot of baseline guidance for initial certification. And if people were paying for an exam that they couldn't really afford, they ended up one, going into debt. They were upset because they, took the test 2, 3, or 4 times. But understanding that there was, kind of a difference in how things were delivered as far as, taking the CBT instead of a paper test, and the psychomotor exam changed multiple times. Those things were kind of important for recognition. We start to talk about the teens of the 2000s, where the psychomotor examination started to get a lot of its traction as far as being different than how it was before. This was essentially what established a true standard across the national registry. There are minimum essential requirements for the didactic education that happens whenever it came to clinical rotations and a lot of that other stuff. It was kind of hard to establish that standard. So in 2010, we started to kind of adapt that in that specific environment. Since then, we've kind of established what the true advanced EMT is, and we've determined that the scope of practice of an advanced EMT is completely different of an intermediate, because intermediates were essentially just sticking IVs. And the advanced EMT is one of the hardest tests to take in the United States. And ironically enough, the advanced EMT test itself is inherently more difficult based off of statistics than the actual paramedic exam, because the biggest jump in EMS is between the EMT basic and the advanced EMT. There are only about 4% of EMS professionals that are nationally registered advanced EMTs, and that is because that test is extremely difficult. But now we can kind of fast forward to 2022 and 2023, where we start to talk about the National Registry and their capacity to change the ALS examination. I know a lot of people are kind of wanting to hear about how that's going to function. So now that we're kind of in phase 3 or phase 4 of that production, we are starting to actually push that out in pilot exams right now. So a lot of the EMS professionals that have the capacity to take these exams whenever they're progressing their career may end up with a pilot, but it's not set in stone to do a hard conversion to taking the longer or the extended cognitive exam until July of 2025. The last board meeting that we had in August of 22 kind of outlined what the plan was going to be, and it was going to be a slow rollout. But this is going to completely change how we test, how we teach, and how we approach education as a whole, because we won't be testing as much on hands-on stuff. It'll be more to kind of focus in on the adapted CBT exam is going to come out for all different levels of the test, but it's supposed to be a lot more difficult to kind of compensate for that lack of hands-on skills. Now, of course, you're going to have to do your labs and you're going to have to do your clinical rotations and stuff, but to test twice didn't really make sense to a lot of the board members that sat on the NRNT. And they finally kind of said, well, we're going to sunset this. So they start sunsetting next July, and they have 1 year to completely sunset those programs. So that's just a little brief synopsis about the history of the organization and the organizational leadership as far as education.
A crazy takeaway that I didn't even realize was that a low percentage for the advanced EMT that you mentioned before between the EMT to advanced EMT. That's a kind of a nugget of information to kind of take away, that those advanced EMTs, hats off to y'all for that's a tough test, and I kind of did that leap from EMT straight to medic. So I don't know what that kind of advanced EMT course in that test is like. So that's a really interesting takeaway. And so now that kind of brings us to the segue of the present, and we have a kind of a whole host of things, as it pertains from the provider perspective, and as it pertains to being an instructor and the instructor perspective. And if you can touch really kind of on that, and kind of really where we are in the present, and some of the hurdles that we have to really overcome as instructors, and the hurdles that the providers have to overcome in order to really become educated, as well as for the instructors as well. If you can kind of touch on that.
Absolutely. So I think one of the biggest things is going to be the cost itself. Becoming an EMS educator is not necessarily the most difficult thing that's there. A lot of state certificates and certifications are relatively easy to acquire. It's the other courses that would make the current EMS professionals a little bit more stronger in their practice that tend to cause a gigantic rift in what it is that we do. Whenever COVID first hit us, some of these, National Association of EMTs courses were almost $1,000. And a lot of people can't afford that. I understand that a lot of us were considered essential, and we were kind of working a lot and getting all this overtime and such. But even in that capacity, now that the cadence of COVID has kind of slowed down to a specific level, people are starting to go back to school in person. They're starting to do their clinical rotations and completion in their respective environments. But the one thing that hasn't really changed is the cost of an EMS program. Even an EMT basic program since the beginning of the pandemic went up exponentially, even though we were short EMS providers throughout the entire aspect of the pandemic. We were short providers in general. There was a shortage of nurses, there was a shortage of doctors, and that's because a lot of them experienced burnout, or they went into different modalities of medicine. But at the same time, kind of thinking about how expensive it is for an actual EMS provider to gain these skills to broaden their scope or broaden their knowledge set, it's not something that is the most feasible option for a lot of people. And I think that is one of the biggest issues that we have is, kind of cost effectiveness for teaching these programs. Most times, whenever we teach certain courses that like PHTLS or AMLS, those cards are only about $10. And individuals are charging $500, $600, $700 for this specific course. And some people will need this to function in their specific environment. Here in critical care, if you work in critical care, you have to have PHTLS, AMLS, the neonatal resuscitation protocol, and a number of different courses. But if you have to spend $6,000 to get those, people are less apt to going there. And subsequently, it kind of leaves a kind of negative stigma towards those of us who do teach these courses, because not all of us teach courses for that. There's a way to make education affordable and applicable, even if education is your sole job and you're working as an independent educator. It's definitely possible.
That is such, and I mean, I know for me, personally, when I was going through my critical care, I saw, kind of firsthand from kind of a provider perspective on just, the cost of really obtaining all of those certs and thousands of dollars in some cases. And then when it was all said and done, like you're saying, a cumulative of thousands of dollars worth of kind of accrued financial spending on these courses, and they're kind of, in some cases, if you take, when you take these courses and you get further
Mm-hmm.
educated, and of course at the cost of sometimes thousands of dollars, you find the other problems that we seem to have is when we take that back to our prospective agencies, and there's really not a lot of financial incentive to actually have gone to go get those classes to begin with.
Absolutely. And it's because, well, one, EMS agencies suffered a lot during COVID. And I know that it's only been 3 years, and some of these disparities with EMS education have been for the last decade, but even more so after call volume started to decrease, or they had to start cutting individuals because they had to reduce the ratio or reduce the number of people that were allowed on trucks. It was not a fiscally sound idea for a lot of these organizations to go and try and pay these card courses out. Even with, individuals like myself who teaches them for essentially, low cost or no cost, in comparison to other people who have a faster, course time to where they can provide it faster than I can. Even if it's a difference between $450 a course, if their call volume is not high enough, they don't have the money to put towards clinical education, and subsequently all the providers tend to suffer.
And we see that a lot because in the sense of like the financial aspect, you have individuals, and we've run into individuals together, and then obviously individually in our own careers, and where we see individuals who kind of suffer financially due to low pay of being a first responder. The pay is not very lucrative, and so there's that aspect there that even if uh, you really wanted to take this course, and you were like, you wanted to further education so that you can be a better provider for your patients, and you end up running into that roadblock of, you have a family to take care of and others responsibilities financially, on top of the fact that first responders aren't really compensated quite well to begin with.
Oh, absolutely not. In comparison to some of the other professionals that work, kind of equal or below us in certain aspects, as a lot of paramedics are starting to work on the floor as physician extenders and have a scope of practice that is of a physician. Even in those specific aspects, um, it's kind of disheartening to see that individuals are being compensated the way that they are based off of the level of work that they're completing. It's very hard for a paramedic to go from a box and working in a hospital to work in an ICU and be responsible for the job of respiratory therapy, for the job of the registered nurse, for the job of a nurse practitioner, PA, or MD whenever they're functioning as an extender. And, they're still making that same $23, $24 an hour that they were making whenever they first started, but we're not compensating them for filling in for the provider in the absence of a provider when the provider's on call. That's a huge thing. And these hospitals have not quite caught up yet. Now, I understand that putting medics on the floor in the ICUs and on med surg is a relatively new process, and we've been fighting for years to get this to this point. But at the same time, hospitals need to understand that whenever they're putting these, the EMS professionals in these specific positions and they're not appropriately compensating, one, it tends to lead to a change in the thought process about how the environment is that they're working in, right? They need to feel valued. They need to feel as if, they're meant to be here. And then kind of approaching certain things as far as how certain people in the hospital don't necessarily get along with EMS providers because of the level of scope of practice they're extended, by the doctor that they're working for. It almost seems as if it's compensatory, but in reality, at the end of the day, we're all here for the patient. And in most professions in healthcare, if not all of them, we have one major duty, to the patient, and that's to make sure that the patient is safe and has, kind of that true definition of health. And the definition of health is them being free or lacking, that illness or ailment that they came in from. So, having that in mind, it almost seems as if we tend to do other EMS providers a disservice by offering them substandard pay, but expecting more of them. It's as if we're adding on things, and at a certain point, it may lose balance and fall over, and then we've just lost an EMS provider.
But those are the kind of issues that providers, and there's more obviously things that providers are kind of having to deal with in our current times of EMS education and obtaining education, with financial difficulties and then access and inclusivity. But then there's kind of the other side of the coin, and that's the instructor side, and where we have some kind of things as far as instructors, maybe say some kind of obtuse ratios that we're dealing with from provider to instructor ratios, and maybe some issues with instructors, which I've seen myself, who maybe shouldn't be really carry the rank of instructor at all. And I don't know, from your perspective of being an instructor yourself and an educator for as long as you have, your kind of take on some of those bad actors, and kind of where the that kind of concept.
So I think a lot of people are really fond of the idea of education, because it kind of pulls them out of an environment that is very high cadence and makes them uncomfortable if they do it for too long. So a lot of people will default to the idea of becoming a clinical educator, and to do that to get them off of the box or to get them out of the hospital because it's a change of pace. I've said this before, and I'll say it 1,000 times. It does not matter, if you have the capacity to take and pass a course that gives you a certificate. It does not mean that you're going to be an effective educator. There are a lot of things that we have to do to make sure that we are an effective educator, and it's not something that happens overnight. I didn't become comfortable with teaching EMS until I was certified for the first 3 years of my educational career. But kind of in turn, some of these older senior educators are now becoming the individuals who are putting information in textbooks. And whenever they're putting this information in textbooks, a lot of the information is not necessarily the things that are the most up to par, or still even in clinical practice guidelines, or standard operating procedure for the national EMS standards, and that causes a huge issue with how individuals are taught and they receive information in school, because they're essentially learning information that's no longer accurate. For a good course, I think one instructor, if it's like distance learning or hybrid learning, is like 1 to 20 or 1 to 30. A lot of people will teach in person, and that ratio is more like 1 to 6, or anywhere between 1 to 6 and 1 to 10, which is a lot better of a ratio. It doesn't matter, if the education's in person or if the didactic information is done, kind of hybrid or completely online. It's a lot for one educator to try and manage that many students. And subsequently, I think whenever it's one instructor or one primary instructor and some junior instructors to a class of 30 people, things tend to get behind. Assessment aspects and grading tend to kind of lack a little bit. And then whenever it comes to talking about skills and stuff, it's very hard to manage 30 people with one instructor. It is very hard.
Yeah. So, and that's, I mean, I've experienced that too in classes I've taken, where like the class sizes are so large, and then you have this poor one instructor that's trying their the best they can, but they've got they've so many people with questions, and it's really not a good environment for the instructor whatsoever, and it puts them in a disservice to the instructor as well. And then kind of like touching on the bad actors, or let's say bad actors is maybe not the best way of describing it, but they're those who get kind of thrusted in education, maybe as just as a stepping stone in their career, as the next perceivable step, as well. Maybe I'll go be an educator, and then you run into those educators who aren't really truly passionate, or aren't really truly it's really in every fiber of their being to educate people, and it's really just taken as just the kind of the next step to achieve a pay raise.
I mean, it is. I mean, as I kind of talked about, some of the educators moving into the creation of learning material, we can kind of tell, unfortunately, who should and should not be in certain aspects as far as being in that level of leadership for EMS. There have been a number of specific situations where people have moved from just working as EMS educators or EMS instructors in their respective locale. They've gone on and they start writing textbooks and they start doing things, and the information that they're passing out is outdated. But in my experience, oftentimes that I've kind of tackled these textbook editors and these textbook publishers, it's deep rooted in bias or stigma, and things that need to be changed. And unfortunately, one of the biggest things that tends to be, kind of biased against is mental health. And unfortunately, mental health is one of the things that we all need to be the most educated about, because we never know exactly what someone's going through and when they're going through it or why they're going through it. And trying to learn how to navigate, how to deal with that type of thing is very difficult whenever you have textbook publishers that are giving you information that's outdated, and they tell you a specific way to interact with a case, and it no longer be good practice or common practice. In fact, a lot of the things that I have, kind of tackled in the last year, as far as the things that I've been relatively public with, have been out of common practice for the last 10 years, which kind of scares me a little bit, because we're using textbooks that were created in 2014 for a lot of paramedic programs, and they've all got the same material, which is not safe. It's not safe for the patient. It's not safe for the provider. It's not safe for the current status quo of EMS, and it's not good for the progression of education within EMS either.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure nobody likes, obviously the kind of all of these things that kind of feel like we're kind of sitting in the negative and talking about all these different negative things. However, we always like to spin things in a positive way. And as Jay has taught me, the kind of tactic of reframing and being able to look at how can we have issues and we've got some things we can fix and we need to kind of address. So then the next question we must really ask ourselves is solutions. What solutions can we put forth, are good things that we can kind of start doing so that we can start moving momentum in the right direction?
So one of the first things that we can do is to kind of evaluate, just as ourselves, what it is that we're doing in the EMS profession. We always have to look inward whenever it comes to talking about things that we need to adjust, and we don't do that as frequently as we should. The one thing I've always heard is that you ever become super comfortable with a specific aspect of EMS or a specific case, that it's something that you need to reevaluate, and you may be too comfortable and you may need to leave the profession. Now, that may not be the case for everybody, but if you're ever super comfortable or feel as if you've got everything down in the bag, and there's no question about how things have changed with evolutionary process and the scientific method, then there's definitely an issue there. But access to coursework that is not ridiculously expensive, that your fresh EMT basic can go out and afford without having to sacrifice the capacity to pay their electric bill or their car insurance, is paramount. The average cost of an EMT basic program within the last 10 years has gone up almost 115%. There are EMS programs that are out here that are about $2,500 to $3,000 just for an EMT basic program. And the first program that I sat for was less than $800. So I get that people have to make money in a certain capacity, but at the same time, it should not break the bank of individuals who want to go out and seek a profession to where they're going to learn skills to save people's lives. I don't feel like it's appropriate. I don't feel like it's effective, which is why I teach my courses for relatively low cost, or I teach them for free, because I think that knowledge is power, and we cannot put a price tag on what power is in the aspect of knowledge. I can teach all of these. I can teach all these courses, and I can do all of this wonderful work in education. But if I'm the only person that's taking the initiative to make that change, to make it affordable for everyone, and I'm restricted to ratios, I can't teach the entire profession. I can't teach all 4 million of us. It's not going to happen. But what I can do is start to approach things in a manner to where general education that may not provide card courses would pique the interest of individuals, and maybe they'll sit and they'll start to reflect internally to see if there's maybe something that they need to do to make themselves a better provider, to make themselves a better, educator, or just to make themselves a better person in general, because we should always be striving to grow and making ourselves better.
Absolutely. And, I think that really kind of ties into your mission and what you're doing and kind of your boots on the ground, what your company and kind of really just what you stand for is kind of out on display, and what you're trying to do, and kind of, bumping up against the stigmas that really, in mental health, those are ever present, and they may not be as noticeable within the education, but obviously we clearly see that there's stigmas and barriers within education of EMS and obtaining, due to cost and due to the inability to have access to it if you're, and especially in a low income situation. And so Beyond the Sirens and your agency have really have been trying to go against what the status quo, and to look at these problems and as kind of like holistically and go, okay, this is a problem and this is a problem, and we need to find ways to have a counter response to said problem, and instead of kind of just accepting it as a status quo or accepting it as the way that it's just going to be, we kind of said, no, we can, change can happen. It's hard. It's going to be a process, but really, you know, it's a, it's just going to take a lot of, moving parts, but at the end of the day, I think we can accomplish what we're trying to do. And it really just kind of looks at the cost of things and finding a way to make it equitable and make it more inclusive and more available for people, as well as being able to just, have that decrease those barriers to
Mhm.
access.
In the general consensus, I think that what it is that I do with bullets and band-aids is more so to just provide general education to individuals who don't have the capacity. As a student, when I started, I didn't really have that much either. I started off as a CNA. It was very hard for me to afford anything that was of that capacity. And being that, kind of 19, 20, 21-year-old EMT who wanted to expand what it was that I knew, it wasn't necessarily as expensive as it was now, but the cost of living has changed since 2013 when I first started. So, kind of looking at that and kind of seeing, how I've paid for certain things over the years, per research cycle. And I've kind of added up what it was that I've spent for, between the things that I need to do to be a clinician and the things that I need to do to be an educator. I've spent over $10,000 on education in the last 10 years, just in response to or in regard to EMS. Now, some of those do include instructor certifications and things like that, but kind of being in that realm to where I wanted to learn everything and I wanted to have everything, so that way I felt like I was the best rounded that I could be. It wasn't necessarily a feasible option to do this all in 1 year or 2 years. I had to do it over the course of like 6 or 7 years, and in that time frame, you got to research for most things. I mean, most of your cards, it's 2, 3, 5, or 6 years. So I had to do some research, but the good thing is that they typically are a little bit cheaper. But in the grand scheme, there has to be a way to where we can start to, address or tackle the idea of not, charging people an arm and a leg or whatever it is that you're gonna, say to get these courses. It doesn't really make sense. It's not the best way to approach it, but we're also letting a lot of our EMS clinicians down by making something so unachievable, whenever we have the capacity to make it achievable. We do. We just choose not to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, I think that's a great point, that we as educators are letting our providers down. It's, it's kind of, that comes with the responsibility of being an educator, is that we have to be looking out for those who we, and in all capacities, not just like, okay, the actual active participation of the course, but how do they get access to it, and kind of all that kind of ins and outs of education is, I think important. And that's such a really good point to really kind of harp on, that we have a duty and a responsibility to, as clinicians to our patients, but as educators to those who are tasked, or that we're tasked with providing education to. And so I think in summation, we, to cap off, you know, EMS week day two, it really is kind of looking at, we're bathed in such a rich history, and a history to be proud of, and to be prideful of, but at the same time to also be reflective of the things that we need to change, so that, as times change, we need to adapt and be malleable and be able to, change with the times, or we're going to be left behind. And so I think it's very important that we appreciate our past for what it is, but we also recognize that we need to start making moves and changes to start fixing these issues, such as, like we discussed, the financial aspect for providers and making it more accessible and inclusive and more attainable for a provider. And then also being able to make it so that instructors who are out there, doing a fantastic job and that are out there serving their calling are not being bombarded with ratios that are just out of control, and makes it very hard for them. Because I think all of us can agree, if you remember when you have that one-on-one experience with your instructor, like it's just so much more, there's so much more to it. There's so much more that an instructor can do when they have less people to have to instruct, and they can actually be more personal, and it can really affect the learning experience from the student, as well as all of the kind of translating into solutions. These are all our problems that we're having, and so now we need to create solutions, which at Bullets and Band-Aids and Beyond the Sirens, we are doing just that and trying to combat and fight against a lot of these issues by making education more accessible, more affordable, so that those out there can who really have the desire for learning and have the passion and craving to be a better provider don't have to sit on their hands and sit on the sidelines because they can't afford it, or they just cannot get access to it. And so really that kind of leads us to our closing remarks, and really just anything that you would like to add or kind of say, where obviously where could people find you, or locate you, get in contact with you if they need to kind of take your courses and things like that, as well as just anything you'd like to kind of add. And again, we're very appreciative and thankful to have you on the podcast to be able to just pour out your wisdom and your educational experience with the viewer.
Well, absolutely. I think that I never wanted to be a teacher at first. I'm not going to lie to you. That kind of just, it was happenstance. The Army typically will kind of throw you into these positions and kind of force you to do these things. And I didn't start off teaching EMS. I started teaching something completely different. That's non-factor. But after, kind of seeing that light bulb click in younger kids, it automatically was one of those things to where I was like, well, let me just, kind of explore the idea. And I didn't think I was going to like it, but I absolutely love it. I mean, I love it so much that I've been doing it for almost 10 years. So that's pretty cool. But as far as, kind of obtaining coursework and stuff, the best way to obtain coursework is, well, I guess it's going to depend on where it's coming from. NAEMT courses are pretty much, you can search for whenever they're listed, or you can join the Beyond the Sirens community, wink, wink, cough, cough, because that's where most of it's posted for now. But outside of that, there maybe TikTok. I can find people through there, but ideally, the idea of the community is probably a little easier. Everyone's there; they have the capacity to kind of look through what it is that I have to teach, and then they can just take as is. Again, courses are relatively low cost; they're done based off of donations. I don't think that there should be a price tag on education. I think that education is power, and we should all have that power for us. Um, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah, it's been a privilege to have Jay as a part of the family of Beyond the Sirens, and just his wisdom, his kindness, his selflessness to education has been just a breath of fresh air, and he really is the archetype of what a true educator should be. In my opinion, just being a student and learning from him, because it is very rare to see an educator who loves educating so much that they're willing to take a financial sacrifice at the expense of their own monetary gain, so that that individual and provider can be the best provider that they can be. And that really truly, I think, sums up what an educator really is at all cost, that no matter what the obstacle, that they're going to remove that obstacle in order for that the instructor student connection to be achieved, and not to just see a barrier and just take a loss there, but rather they see the barrier and they find ways to maneuver around it so that they can still provide the education for the provider. And it's just so amazing to see firsthand in the community. So the community is referencing is Beyond the Sirens community. If you're a first responder, so you're a paramedic, EMT, you're a nurse, you're a firefighter, medic, EMT, student, who is in any of those disciplines, we'd love to have you join the Discord community, so that we do classes of all different types, from critical care to the NAEMT courses that Jay puts on. And it would just be great to have you a part of the family. We are growing and we want to continue to grow so that we can continue to grow this mission of what we are trying to do here, and really trying to grow this, trying to advocate for better practices in education, better mental health practices, and just a better overall life as a first responder. And with that really said, if you don't have much left to add, Jay, then we can kind of we can go wheels down and we can go out of service.
I think that's all I got. I mean, outside of teaching about mental health resilience in the next few days, that's it.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's the other thing. If you've never heard about the MHRO course, I definitely urge you to check it out on the NAMT website. We need more of those people who, obviously, if you have a passion for helping your fellow responder in crisis, and it's just, I'm sure it's, and Jay can probably talk more about it. We're going to do more podcasts where we'll spend more time on resilience and mental health, and because that is his shtick. And we will talk more about that in a future podcast to come. But just plugging that MHRO course, important to take a peek at it if you really have a passion for helping your fellow first responders in crisis and learning tactics on de-escalation and really how to make a difference. It's worth taking a look at. So without further ado, we're going to go 10-7 out of service, and we are going to go wheels down, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on this podcast. Thank you, Jay, for being here and being able to expound on all the things EMS education. And we'll see you on the next one, ladies and gentlemen.